So the story isn't actually my own experience. It happened to my older brother and sister. I do have a bit of context to give so the whole thing will make sense, so please bear with me. My family and I grew up in Southeast Alaska. The area we used to live in was primarily a fishing and tourist town that was settled in between some mountains and a channel that led out to the sea. And during the summer months, loads of tourists would flock to the town we lived in to see the beautiful mountains and the glacier that our town was known for. The only two ways to really get to the area was by taking a ferry or flying in on a plane, because you couldn't really drive through the mountains. There were also several smaller towns and settlements scattered through the mountain range nearby, mostly made up of little cabins and old houses. These were almost exclusively populated by elderly folks who had bought property in the areas for when they wanted to go on fishing trips, and my grandparents were among them. At the time, my grandpa owned several small bush planes that he would use to fly people between these tiny towns as a small business. And he also used a blue shack in one of these towns that me and my siblings still to this day affectionately refer to as the Blue Cabin, because it was painted a shade of peeling baby blue. My grandpa and grandma had owned the cabin for years before I was born, and they often took us out to it for a week or two during the summers when I was a kid. This is where the story takes place. It had been several years since me and my siblings had gone on a trip to the cabin because of some personal problems my mom had been having with her dad a couple of years before this story took place. I can't exactly remember why, but my mom had been out of town for a long trip, and during her absence, my grandpa had offered to fly us out to the cabin for a weekend. Me and my dad and my two older siblings all leapt at the opportunity to revisit such a nostalgic place. So after packing some basics, cue a montage of all of us meeting at the airport, the 2-hour flight in a cramped bush plane that I remember being much bigger, and quickly finding ourselves riding through the tiny town we would be staying in my grandpa's dinky old truck headed for the Blue Cabin. We got ourselves nice and settled with the ridiculous amount of spiders that would be sharing the cabin with us for the next couple of days, and my grandpa left us to enjoy our weekend. Now, I can't quite remember what me and my dad were doing. Probably walking on the beach, when my brother and sister had decided to take one of the two four-wheelers my grandpa kept at the cabin for a ride through one of the trails through the forest surrounding the town. It was around sundown, and at some point while they were re-exploring the dirt trails that we used to drive down as kids, they had spotted an old house through the trees. Now, this wasn't super uncommon for this tiny town, because most of the houses or cabins were old as balls and were also unoccupied all year round, save for a couple of months in the summer when the owners came to fish. This house, however, looked absolutely decrepit. It had a metric fuck ton of moss and dead leaves everywhere, and it looked like it had been abandoned for at least 20 years. Seeing as I wasn't there, I have no idea what the thought process was exactly. But they ended up driving the four-wheeler down the incredibly narrow driveway that connected the house to the main trail and then parked it, before then making their way to the shabby building. They walked around the perimeter looking for a way inside for a bit. The only way in turned out to be the front door, which was locked, so they ended up kicking it in. According to them, they'd figured it had been abandoned for such a long time that no one would care. My brother kicked in the door so hard that the deadbolt broke right off, which I suspect was only so easy because of its age and poor upkeep. They stepped inside to find a dusty, weathered kitchen. They described it as having looked as if people had left it intending to come back, but seemingly never did. There were cans of beans out on the counter, some of them open and buzzing with flies. There was a pot of old nasty water sitting on the stove, and there was also a collection of very niche holiday mugs on a shelf, the kind someone's grandma might keep somewhere. As they walked through the kitchen, they kept hearing this brief chirping noise from somewhere upstairs, and they figured it was one of two things. Either a bird or an aggravated squirrel, upset that someone was intruding on his territory, or some type of alarm. They were rather skeptical of the latter option because the house had been abandoned for years with no power or water, and anything powered by battery was probably long dead. They didn't think too much of it though, and they just kept wandering deeper into the house. Past the kitchen was a living room with an old pump piano, some musty furniture, and on a wall beside that was a staircase that led upstairs. There were some old bookshelves as well, full of books about how to build your own nuclear bunkers. They kept periodically hearing that quiet chirping from somewhere above them, but they just kept ignoring it. My brother had taken one of the old books and was flipping through it, describing the contents to my sister, who had walked over to the old piano and had begun absent-mindedly pressing on the keys. As soon as she pressed the second key, suddenly the chirping from upstairs sounded again, but this time it was louder and lasted a bit longer. The best way my sister said she could describe it was that it sounded like a high-pitched, piercing metallic garbling sound that lasted no more than about 2.5 seconds. My brother and sister froze in place, shitting bricks. They had no idea what was upstairs that had just made that noise, but it had freaked them out bad enough that they just looked at each other, thinking, "We need to run." They both immediately started booking it out of the house into the four-wheeler. And apparently my brother was so scared that he didn't even bother turning it around to face the road. He just drove it backwards until they pulled all the way out of the driveway. In his haste to run away, my brother hadn't even bothered to reshelf the book. He had just had it in his hand the whole time he was running away. They talked about what they thought the noise could have been once they got back to the cabin, and my brother was convinced that it was a ghost that he had angered by taking the book off the shelf. He thought that meant that he had to return it, but since it was already really dark out, they decided to just do it the next day. My sister was unconvinced that it was supernatural, but she was curious about what had made the noise, so she agreed to go again. On the next morning, they had told me about the house and the sound, and they brought me along this time. We carefully retraced their route through the house, occasionally hearing the same quiet chirps from upstairs. When we managed the nerve to go up, we discovered it was an old-ass smoke detector that had been running on low batteries for probably 2 decades and was having weird technical malfunctions, hence the metallic garbling from the day before. We had a good laugh about it, but we kept exploring. We ended up finding some other cool things from upstairs. More books, letters, and a check to someone for $2,000. We honestly debated if we could cash it, but it was already addressed to someone, unfortunately. We learned from some old letters that we had found in the desk drawers in the master bedroom that the house was owned by an elderly couple. If I'm remembering correctly, the husband had served in the military when he was a bit younger, and he was a survivalist nut, hence the books on nuclear bunkers. They had a son who had been expecting a baby on the way, but right before it was due, the man who owned the house was diagnosed with cancer, and he had to be moved to a place with a proper hospital. His wife went to live with their son for a while her husband was in recovery, and I guess they just never came back. I don't know whatever happened to him, but the fact that he never came back isn't an amazing omen. I'm happy he got the medical treatment that he needed, and that he got to pass peacefully of old age. Anyway, I know the story might not be terrifying, but it certainly scared the crap out of me and my siblings when they heard the smoke detector. As much as it was fun exploring that abandoned house, we were kind of young and stupid, and I don't recommend people do that kind of thing. If you can't be convinced not to, then wear a face mask to protect yourself from spores or asbestos, and always bring something to defend yourself with in case squatters are living in the abandoned buildings. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this story, and stay safe, everyone. My name is Brenna. I was at my friend's house, Shauna, and my sister Dakota was there too. We got on the topic of exploring abandoned places, and Shauna mentioned that she had found an abandoned shack not too far away from her house. We really loved anything creepy or scary, so we decided to go find it. It was in the woods, and Shauna remembered where it was, so we got there pretty quickly. It had a bunch of bush around it and lots of plants growing on it. It had obviously not been inhabited in a while. There was also a smashed car outside by it. I'm not talking like just the window smashed in. I'm talking like a car fell off a bridge type smashed. We found the front door to the shack and pulled really hard on it to open it. As soon as the door opened, a bat came flying out straight at Dakota. We found it funny, and I guess we were laughing because it made us extra nervous to go in. But like idiots, we still went in. It was one open room. There was a loft and a single curtain separating the bathroom. It was absolutely filthy in there. There was so much trash on the floor, not just garbage, but dirty old clothes. There was also a pregnancy test on the floor, and it was used. Pretty gross, right? In the bathroom area, there was a bathtub that was absolutely filthy with brown and black stains all over it, and there was a broken toilet. We climbed the ladder up to the loft part, and I'm honestly surprised it didn't break when we used it. There was a bunch of garbage upstairs too, but there was a queen-size mattress right in the middle of the room with no sheets or blankets, as well as a bunch of kids' drawings that were scattered all over the floor. There was also a calendar that had 2012 on it, so who knows how long that shack has been around for. There was also a notebook with pages ripped in it, and it had a name written on it, and I'm so upset that I don't remember the name. But this is the most concerning part. Laying right on the mattress was a gun, and we live in Canada where guns aren't legal. Also, the trigger was actually broken off the gun. After that, we had decided to just leave and get the hell out of there. Who knows what else we would find if we kept looking. I still have so many questions about what happened there. Why was it in the middle of the woods? Why were there children drawings everywhere and a pregnancy test? Why was there a gun? But also, do I really want to know? I live in a village in Scotland with a population of like 500 people. It sounds rural, but it's only a 10-minute car drive away from the main town and a 45-minute train ride from a big city. The streets in our village have normal houses, but there's a huge hill behind us that has some fancy houses. I don't know how rich the people are up there, but the houses are like grand piano in the front window type of rich. I'm still a teenager now, but this happened when I was 12, so not super long ago. I'm a girl and I have a friend who lives in the same street as me. My other friends all live in the town, so me and this friend, I'll call him Il, hang out together a little more on our own. I've always liked going up to the fancy house area in our village because I can't stress enough how normal the other houses in the village are. We have some council houses, which for Americans, it's basically homes that the government builds for you and then you pay them rent to live there. It's not considered posh at all, and I don't know how this area behind the village is so different. It's like another world. It takes half an hour to walk up this hill to get to the houses, and it's really killer on your legs, but it's worth it. Me and Elle would walk up there and look at the houses, praying that one day we'd both be rich enough to have an awesome house like that ourselves. There is one house that hasn't been lived in for as long as I've lived in this village. There were rumors about it, and people said that a woman killed herself on her wedding night. I don't know what happened to the husband. I don't even know the woman's name or anything, but it seemed perpetually empty. I know it sounds like a typical ghost story, but it intrigued me, and I always wanted to go inside and look around. I know that sounds bad, but I've always been what adults call rebellious, but I believe I'm just simply adventurous. I was always on Elle's back about exploring the house. It didn't look shabby because I guess fancy houses never look bad, but it was run down whereas the others weren't. It's tucked in a little corner, and as none of the other houses are attached to each other, and each feature huge gardens, this one doesn't stand out too much. I guess it doesn't bother anyone in the street because no one ever upkeeps it. The garden is very overgrown and it just looks like a jungle. There are big trees in the front, and everyone calls them witch trees. I don't know what type of tree it is, but they have mega thick bark and they go tall. They look really beautiful, but there's something creepy about them. One of the local ghost stories is that the trees ward off evil, and that witches use them for protection or something. Some people say that the woman who died in the house was a witch and she died by the trees. Others say she died in one of the downstairs rooms. Either way, I always found these stories fun and intriguing because, like I said, I'm adventurous. One day I asked if Elle would be seriously down for exploring the house with me if we snuck in one night. He wasn't sure. He liked exploring just as much as I did, but he was definitely more rational than I was. Sometimes I act without thinking things through for long enough. Our parents wouldn't allow us to be out late due to our age, but after talking about it for weeks, we formulated a plan. Elle then agreed to explore the house with me. We knew that it was possible the doors would be locked and we wouldn't get in, but we thought even if that was the case, we can explore the garden. We figured if we went at nighttime during the winter months, we could explore before we needed to be home. Our parents wouldn't be suspicious, and exploring this house at night would just be the best. It was classic spooky vibes, so we agreed, and we just had to find the perfect time. When the time finally came, it was a Friday night, and we decided to do it after school. I told my friends I was going to go to Elle's house, and Elle told his parents he'd be at my house. We both said we were eating dinner at each other's houses, and our parents took our word for it. Looking back, this was a risky and dumb idea, but it made sense at the time. We didn't have long, and it meant we'd go hungry, but we didn't care. We wanted to explore. When we got to the house, I was buzzing with excitement. We were nervous, and Elle was especially. He kept peering around and whispering at me that the neighbors might catch us, but I told him to chill and it'd all be fine. We hopped over the gate, and boom, we were in the garden. It felt exhilarating. I felt like I was in a Tomb Raider game exploring an ancient Egyptian tomb. We tried to stay quiet, and we had wandered around the garden for a bit. It was really hard to see, so we had used our phone flashlights to look around. But we had to do it carefully so as not to draw attention. It didn't even cross our minds that we were breaking the law. We tried to go around the back, but we couldn't. The hedges and grass, etc. were just way too overgrown to get through. It was too difficult, and we were getting scratched left, right, and center. We approached the front door very cautiously, and I was still buzzing. Elle then asked me if I was 100% sure about this. And I said, of course I am. I remember that he looked like he wanted to back out, but he didn't. He tried the handle, but the door didn't open. I thought it was locked, and I felt disappointed, but Elle made a face, and he told me it felt stiff. He said that maybe we should go just because we had already been in the garden, but I was so determined to get inside. I told him to throw his body at it, and he said hell no. That it would cause too much noise and it was wrong of us to damage the building. I realized he was right, but I felt disappointed again. I decided to try the handle and I fiddled with it for a while. It was really cold and Elle was right. It did really feel stiff and hard to move. I asked him to help me and I pulled my sleeves down to cover my hands. I thought that maybe that would help me to grip it better and that I could then pull harder without hurting my skin. Surprisingly, we actually got the door open after fiddling around with it. It made a loud noise as it creaked open, and Elle's face was a picture of terror. I held my breath too because I was really nervous in case someone heard. I don't know how long we stood there, but we ended up darting inside and shutting the door behind us. The house smelled bad, like just old and kinda damp. I had coughed a little because I had asthma, but I wasn't backing out now. That thrill was swirling around in my stomach as I looked around and grinned at Elle in excitement. He laughed at me and then walked ahead a little bit. The entryway had a staircase and it was a wooden floor, but the stairs had one of those long rug things old wealthy people usually have. There was a brown wooden table thing and a dusty mirror in the entryway. There were lights, but we didn't know how to turn them on, and we figured they wouldn't work anyway. It was pitch black and honestly kind of creepy, but I knew it was just my mind playing tricks on me combined with the excitement of doing something bad and crazy. I looked around with my phone light and there was an archway to the side. I looked at Elle and I asked if he wanted to go in there with me first, and he agreed and started to walk. It was so cool to be in the house wandering around. Everything was so dusty and smelly, but I was having the time of my life. I know that might sound terrible, but no one lived there, so it really felt no different to exploring an abandoned castle from hundreds of years ago. We then saw a photo on one of the walls, and it made me feel uneasy. But again, I just told myself it was my mind messing with me. Still, it made the hairs on my arms stand to attention like soldiers. The photo was a young lady and young guy, somewhere in their 20s. The lady had black hair and she was wearing a dress but not a wedding gown. The man had a smart suit and trousers on, and he had his arm around her and they smiled into the camera. It was like a 50s or 60s sort of vibe, and it was in black and white. I reached out to touch it, and I had heard a noise like clattering, as if something fell. I turned around, but there was nothing there. Elle was beside me, and we kind of just stared at each other, both having heard it. As I said, Elle was a rational dude, so he didn't automatically jump to, "Oh my God, it's a ghost." He said us walking around must be disturbing the house or something, and then maybe it was just time to leave. We hadn't even went upstairs yet, but I had started to feel guilty. I don't know why, but this feeling of pure guilt and sadness just suddenly came over me. I didn't tell Elle. I just said, "Yeah, maybe we should go now." He nodded, and we started to walk to the entryway again, when we then heard something that I can't explain to this day. From the sitting room we just exited, I had heard a soft weeping, as if a woman was softly crying in the room just behind me. I froze and turned to Elle. He looked very uncomfortable, and I asked him if he heard that, and he didn't answer. He then moved his phone flashlight behind us, but nothing was there. The noise was gone just as quick as it had came. I suddenly felt really scared and then said to Elle, "We need to get out of here now." We bolted for the door and swung it open, then ran out. We jumped to the garden and I twisted my ankle. We bolted down the hill and back to our part of the village. We didn't stop until we were in my street, then we both leaned against a wall. I was really scared I would have an asthma attack, but thankfully I didn't. I didn't have my inhaler with me, but I knew Elle would grab it for me if need be. He'd get himself in trouble for me. That's the kind of friend he is. He always has my back and I have his. There's 2 places to get food in our village, including snack foods. We decided to walk there to grab some food since we would be missing dinner, and it was still too early for either of us to head home. I asked Elle about the noise, but he said that we freaked ourselves out because of the urban myths surrounding the house or in our heads. That we just imagined the noise and freaked ourselves out with the picture. He maintains that even to this day. I'm not sure I believe him, although I want it to be true. I know what I heard and I know what I felt. I'm not saying I know it all, but this experience did make me realize that there is some stuff you simply just can't explain. I don't know what it means or even what to call it, but something was definitely going on in that house. The noise was so real. It was like a woman was right there crying. I can still hear it in my mind even as I recount this. That photograph really struck me too. I can't explain it. There was just something in that house. I don't think the vibe was harmful, but there was definitely something going on in there. It still unnerves me even now. We never told anyone, not even our parents. Elle is my best friend, and this is something we decided to not share with anyone else. We do still talk about it sometimes though, but Elle always says that it must have been our minds playing tricks on us. He doesn't dismiss how I feel or my thoughts on it, but he's a very rational guy and I get it. Another thing that creeps me out is that the front door was shut after we left, but me and Elle didn't do it. We bolted out, flung it open, and never shut it again. The door was stiff and heavy, but it shouldn't have shut on its own, and it did. I know it could be argued that it was the weight of the door making it close, but it was one of those doors that don't move on their own. and it wasn't particularly windy either. Maybe someone else shut it, but I'm not so sure. We went back the next day and just stood in the street looking at it, and the door was shut. It's such a creepy thing, especially because we heard the crying from the room that the lady apparently died in. One thing's for sure though, me and Elle will never go into that house or do anything like that ever again. Hey everyone, that's about it for today's stories. If you have your own story that you would like to send, you can send it in at southerncannibal.com, or you can email it at southerncannibalstories@gmail.com. I look forward to telling your story. Have a good night or good day, everyone. And remember to always